Hi, Neil here, LeBron James, uh, Jeremy Bentham, and utilitarianism. That's what we are talking about. Let's get into it. We are going to try to look at some of the criticisms of utilitarianism in a little bit, and but let's see where we are, and that is that Bentham believes that morality is about helping others, and helping other people, being altruistic, has to do with producing pleasurable experiences for other people and preventing painful experiences. Why is helping others uh, causing pleasure, preventing pain for other people? It's because human beings are constructed in such a way that we all desire pleasure and the absence of pain. I mean, it's just the way that we're made. I suppose we could, be made in other ways. Perhaps we could be constructed in a way that all human beings desired apples, and then we would be trying to get as many apples as we can and preventing other people from not having apples, if you want to look at it that way. But what we desire is pleasure. And so we know that when we're helping someone, we are doing things that cause them pleasure and preventing pain for them. So that's pretty basic in that way. One of the other things that we also saw was that since we are focused on pleasures for myself and pleasures for other people, psychologically and morally, what we're looking at in an action are its consequences. Do the consequences of any given act result in pleasure, or do the consequences of any act result in pain? If it results in pain, we try to prevent it. If if the consequences of an act result in pleasure, we try to produce it. Okay, so we're looking at helping others. We're looking at pleasures. We're looking at the consequences of an act. And so what this comes to is that when we act morally, when we are faced with an obligation to do some act or not to do some act, that obligation reduces to the creation of pleasure or the prevention of pain. It's what we are obligated to do. That's what the right act is. It's doing the act that produces the greatest pleasure for people and that prevents the most pain. Which takes us to, with Bentham, this principle called the greatest happiness principle. The greatest happiness principle says, do that act. I mean, this is the right act. Do that act that produces the greatest pleasure or happiness. And both of those are the same thing, according to Bentham. Do that act that produces the greatest pleasure or happiness for the greatest number of people. The greatest pleasure for the greatest people, for the greatest number, the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. It's abbreviated as GHP, the greatest happiness principle. Um, for Bentham, his moral view is the greatest happiness principle, and what that comes to, and another way of saying that, and Bentham says it this way. It's the paragraph that we've read probably most. Is when we act, we're trying to produce the greatest pleasure for the community at large, whatever that community is, the community or the group. If it's pleasure, if the group is a class of students, we're doing something that produces the greatest happiness or pleasure for for that class, for those students. If the community is a city, we're trying to do something that creates the greatest pleasure or happiness for the city, or for the neighborhood, or for the country, or for the world. Not all actions affect everyone. In fact, it's fairly clear. I suppose we could say it's fairly clear that very few people are in a position of acting in a way that does affect everyone. So most of us have a small community of people that we affect. What Bentham is saying is, do those acts that result in the greatest pleasure for that community, the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. Um, Now, so that's the basic idea: helping others, producing pleasure for the most number of people. So one of the things that Bentham does in is the excerpt that I've given you, morality is utility. On the second page, he has something called the hedonistic calculus. Hedonistic comes from a word that means a Greek word hedone, which means pleasure. So it's essentially a calculus of pleasure. And if we look at it, it looks kind of strange. It looks somewhat cumbersome. But when we look at the hedonistic calculus, we can kind of see what Bentham is doing. Keep in mind that Bentham wants a mathematical type of moral principle. And so this is Bentham's attempt to quantify, to measure, to mathematicize our moral behavior, and you can see what he's doing here. Keep in mind that it's one of Bentham's goals is not only mathematics as a methodology, but he wants a moral principle that's simple, exact, and complete. So when we look at the hedonistic calculus, we see 7 elements or 7 features or characteristics of an act. He says these break down into intensity, duration, certainty or uncertainty, propinquity or remoteness, fecundity, purity and impurity, and number 7, um, extent. I don't want to spend too much time going through this. I'm hoping you get some of the idea, but we can look at several of these. By intensity, we can see pretty clearly what Bentham is after. Pleasures and pains have various intensities. Some are strong intensity, some are weaker intensity. So I suppose you could say that for me, a very intense pleasure is coffee ice cream. I really like coffee ice cream. Mitchell's caramel sea salt is my favorite. When I have that ice cream, it's an intense pleasure. I really like it. So that would score high. Um, a less intense pleasure for me would be to have a Coca-Cola, say. I mean, I like Coke, but it's not as intense as eating ice cream for me. An even less intense pleasure, but still a pleasure, I suppose, is wearing blue, wearing a blue shirt. I like blue. It's kind of a nice color. I suppose my favorite color is green. Um, and it gives me pleasure. It's not as intense as drinking a Coca-Cola. It's not as intense as eating ice cream. So there are various levels of intensity to pleasures. There are various levels of intensity to pains also. So when I, for instance, slam my hand in a car door, that's pretty intense pain, and it's very intense pain. When I stub my toe, that's pretty intense pain also. When I'm out of blue shirts, I suppose we could say, when I'm left with just a white shirt, say a white t-shirt, I think I was wearing one in one of the other episodes. Um, it doesn't really give me it doesn't give me pleasure. It causes me a little pain in the absence of what would be pleasurable, which is the blue shirt. Less intense pains are probably talking with someone that I don't particularly like. That might be an intense pain, but you get the idea. There are intense pleasures and intense pains. Intensity is how we think of pleasures. I mean, it is in the back of our mind, if not the front of our mind. Um, the next feature or a characteristic of pleasures and pains is duration. How long does the sensation of pleasure or the sensation of pain last? And some last longer and some don't. So it was a very hot day today. This is true. And if I had even my favorite ice cream, caramel sea salt, it would probably not last very long if I were outside and then it would melt. And so the duration of the pleasure would be less. If I were reading a book that I like, which I also like reading, and actually I was reading also today inside in air conditioning, which gives me pleasure. When I read a book I like, that's not as, maybe we could describe that as not quite as intense a pleasure as eating ice cream, but it lasts a long time. Generally speaking, the books that I read don't melt and they don't freeze. So we can see that reading a book lasts longer than eating an ice cream cone. I will say that slamming your hand in a car door, it's intense pain, and it probably lasts for a long time. You can really screw your finger up. I'm assuming that the number of athletes who injure themselves, um, who damage their ACL. I'm guessing it's really intense pain and it lasts for a long time. It's a bad kind of pain. You definitely want to avoid that sort of pain. If I yell at someone, that probably causes them pain. I don't know how intense, or I should say, I don't know how long lasting that pain is. They may forget about it or not even paying attention to it. But you can see how there's not only more and less intense pleasures and pains, but longer and shorter duration of pleasures and pains. We all take this into account. I think we already do. And let me say a word here, and that is when we evaluate these aspects or any aspects of pretty much any moral theory, but when we are evaluating this aspect of Bentham's theory, we are referring to what I called in the very first episode our intuitive moral sense. We all have some intuition of right and wrong, good and bad, and so I don't have to construct this thing from nothing. I've already got it. It's not like I wait for, or you wait for, an ethics class before you have any sense of what is right and wrong, good and bad. We all have moral intuition. And the point about intuition, moral intuition, that is important is that if a moral theory contradicts badly our moral intuition, there's a good chance that it's incorrect, or at a minimum, it means that we have to look for other aspects of that moral theory and see how the other aspects correspond with our intuitive moral sense. If we find a bunch of things that contradict our intuitive moral sense, there's a pretty good idea that moral sense, that moral theory is incorrect. But it's our moral intuition here that's important, and so we, in a certain sense, are always referring to that. I also should say it may also be, and this is the interplay between our intuitive moral sense and a moral theory. Sometimes, and maybe many times, a moral theory makes us aware of a part of our intuitive moral sense or a part of our intuitive moral behavior that was there and we just hadn't paid attention to. So moral theories can expand our intuitive moral sense. What I'm saying here is that it would be odd if a moral theory contradicted the general moral intuition that most people experience. I mean, the red flags should be up then. So when we look at Bentham's moral theory, the intensity and duration of an action, of a pleasure and pain, that we can see that in some intuitive way, it does describe our intuitive sense. We do pay attention to how pleasurable an action is or an experience is. We do pay attention to how long it lasts, its duration. And there are many other aspects that I'm not going to go into: certainty, uncertainty, propinquity, remoteness, fecundity, and purity and impurity. Many other aspects that go into Bentham's attempt to explain our moral behavior. The other one that's important now, these first six aspects, intensity through purity and impurity, as they're listed on page 2 of Morality is Utility. Those first six aspects really are explaining our psychology of pleasure and pain, and our psychology of action. What becomes moral is where he says, where his feature is called the extent, and that is how widely distributed is the pleasure or pain that is caused by some action. If a pleasure is widely distributed among many people, a large community, that's a better act than if the action, the pleasure or pain is distributed among fewer people. So if I looked at a class, if we were looking at a class of maybe 20 students as opposed to a class of 40 students, the extent would be 20 for the one and 40 for the other. An act that caused pleasure for 20 students would be less pleasure than an act that caused pleasure for 40 students. Now, it may be that those are balanced by the idea, and this really complicates the theory, Bentham's moral theory. It may be complicated by the fact that maybe the 20 students that the act affects are getting a lot of pleasure from the act, where the 40 students that the act is affecting are getting less pleasure. So if you take the total of the first six characteristics, intensity through purity and impurity, if you take that total for the 40 students, that may actually come in at a lesser number, a lower number than those six characteristics do for a fewer number of students. So we're looking for, and this is a contradiction, and it's something that causes a lot of trouble for Bentham's utilitarianism. How do we weigh a great pleasure for a few number of people versus a lesser pleasure for more people? What act do we do? What if the two numbers come out exactly the same for a fewer number of people versus a larger number of people? These are difficulties, and we know that intuitively. We see that as a difficulty. It's not entirely clear how we solve it. It may mean, in fact, that if we can't solve that Bentham's theory is at a disadvantage in that way, and there are reasons why Bentham's theory is yielded, fails, and one of the reasons are contradictions or confusions like that. I hope you get that point. I don't want to spend way more time on that, but there is another related difficulty to this. And when we're talking about Bentham's moral theory as a theory that has to do with producing pleasure for other people, the problem that arises is that Bentham's and this is an important problem, that Bentham's psychology says that we as individuals desire pleasure. That's the way human beings operate. We desire pleasure and greater pleasure and only pleasure. We can only desire pleasure and the reduction of pain or the avoidance of pain. You should take those as meaning the same. We can only desire pleasure for ourselves. There's no other thing that we desire. That's just psychology, according to Bentham. But if you take that psychology, that we can only desire, that individuals only desire pleasure for themselves, that's what I only experience my own pleasure, then how is it that we can follow Bentham's moral obligation, which is to cause pleasure for the group? I mean, how do I as an individual function psychologically so that I can then act morally, in Bentham's terms, and act in the interests of other people? I mean, it would seem that if I want pleasure, why would I ever do something for someone else, except as it causes me pleasure. And yet Bentham's moral suggestion or idea is that the morally right act is to be helpful, and being helpful is, in his terms, causing pleasure for other people. But I can only function psychologically by what causes me pleasure. And so the agent who's acting, what motive does he or she have to act in another person's interest? And so that is a great difficulty for Bentham. And the way that we can think of that, and Bentham has various solutions to this, and it probably is not very adequate when we get right down to it. And that is one of the ways that I can cause pleasure for other people psychologically, or I'm sorry, one of the ways that I can follow Bentham's moral suggestion that what is morally right is to act in the interest of others, to help other people. One of the ways that I can follow that, even though that I can only act psychologically in my own interest, for my own pleasure, is that there are many things that we do, that I as an individual do for other people, that that actually causes me pleasure. So, for instance, if I, let me take this example. I, as a teacher, get pleasure when my students are successful, when my students learn, or end up, being able to do something or get to a place where they haven't been before. That causes me pleasure. So my motive in this way, in Bentham's theory, my motive to help students is that it causes me pleasure. It's still my pleasure. So I'm not violating Bentham's psychology. I'm doing something that causes me pleasure. It so happens, however, that one of the things that causes me pleasure is helping other people. If I help, someone across the street who's having a hard time, my motive for that is that it gives me pleasure to help other people. That's not violating Bentham's moral psychology. It's still pleasure for myself. We might call that in Bentham's terms, we might call that the principle of sympathy. And that is that all human beings have sympathy for other people. We feel pleasure when other people feel pleasure, and we feel pain when other people feel pain. So I would want someone to avoid pain because seeing them experiencing pain causes me pain. I want to avoid pain, so I help you. If I see that that you're in a car accident and you're in pain, I pull you out of the car because it is painful for me to see that you're in pain. It's the principle of sympathy. We feel the pleasures and pains that other people feel. So I can act in your interest because I feel your pleasure or I feel your pain, and therefore want to help you avoid that pain. There's another, so that we might call that the principle of sympathy. There's another idea that I can act in my own pleasure and still end up helping people, even though my goal is not to help other people, even though I don't particularly feel sympathy. In other words, this is another idea. So how do we deal with this notion that I can only do something that's in my self-interest, that causes me pleasure? How can I help others if I don't naturally feel sympathy for them? In other words, if I don't naturally feel pleasure when other people feel pleasure, why would I help them? Well, this is an idea in Bentham that we might get, where I cause you pleasure not by aiming at your pleasure, because this particular notion says I don't get pleasure from your pleasure, but it just so happens that the world is constructed that when I get pleasure, it automatically causes pleasure for you. The example I would use for that is, speaking of blue shirts, when I shop at a store, I'm not shopping for clothing because it causes you pleasure. I'm shopping for clothing because it causes me pleasure. But on the other hand, or maybe the same hand, if I shop for clothing because it causes me pleasure, my spending money gives you pleasure, or will eventually, because my spending money in a store allows you to get paid, allows you to make money, which then that you can use that money that I have caused you to have by functioning in my interest, by buying shirts for myself. It gives you money to buy what you want. You may want to buy ice cream, and by my buying a shirt in your store, you have money to buy ice cream. So I don't act in your interest, but I act in my interest. But acting in my interest automatically or accidentally acts in your interest. So one of the ways that Bentham's egoistic psychology, I can only act in my pleasure. It could be I act in my pleasure. The first alternative I mentioned could be that I act in my pleasure for my pleasure because giving you pleasure causes me pleasure. But it could be that it doesn't give me pleasure to give you pleasure, but it may be accidental that I give you pleasure when I act for myself. I'm hoping that you can see that. So there's two possibilities of why I would act in your interest. Your interest is my interest, or acting in your interest accidentally acts in your interest, or it may be that neither of those is the case, and that the only reason that I give you pleasure or I prevent pain for you is not because I get pleasure or pain from your interest, or it accidentally acts in your interest. It may be that if I don't act in your interest, that I'm punished for not acting in your interest. So I act in my interest to help you or not harm you, because I'll get punished if I don't. So I may believe, and this is I may believe that drinking causes me pleasure. So I'm out for a night drinking. I get in my car, and I'm getting in my car drunk, and I don't avoid that, not because I'm concerned for your welfare, but I'm concerned that if I drive drunk, I'll get arrested, which would cause me pain. So the fear of punishment gets me to act in your interest. It's not because I feel anything about your interest. It's not because I'm accidentally acting in your interest. It's because if I don't act in your interest, in other words, prevent pain for you or give you pleasure, it's that if I don't act in your interest, I'm punished. So there are, and we can call that maybe the artificial identification of interest. Your interest and mine are the same in this sense because I'm punished if I don't take your interest as my interest. I know that it will cause you pain if I drive drunk and get in an accident, but I avoid it so that I don't get punished. So the problem here is acting in how does Bentham deal with this idea that I can, as he says very clearly, I am governed only by my desire for pleasure and my desire to avoid pain. It's all I act in. So why would I act in anybody else's interest? Why would I give them pleasure by helping them? It's because our pleasures may be aligned. So what causes you pleasure causes me pleasure. It may be that there's an accidental alignment, meaning that I don't aim at your pleasure, but it just happens that when I satisfy myself, I am also satisfying you. And it may be, thirdly, that I act in your interest because I'm punished if I don't. I hope you get that, and I don't want to overdo that explanation. It will only cause you to be probably more confused. So there's the hedonistic calculus. We've talked about that. There's the idea of how we act in other people's interests, given that psychologically I can only act in my interest, only create pleasure for myself. My notes are over here, so that's why I'm looking off to the side. I don't want to miss these. And then there's another whole issue, and that is this idea of that Bentham claims that, and I ask you this as a question, that Bentham claims that the only motive that we can have is the desire for pleasure and the desire to avoid pain. And I'm going to read this first paragraph or this part because it's so important. And I should have read it before, but it's so important to have this in front of us. Bentham says, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. And that is the idea that Bentham says the only thing that motivates us is the desire for pleasure and the desire to avoid pain. That's it. There ain't no other desire. And I asked you for one of the exercises to try to think if there was, try to think if you could come up with some other thing that motivated us. You know, is there anything that we desire other than pleasure or pain? And it's very hard to do that. Everything can be reduced to pleasure. And some of you have probably already come up with some of the examples that I use. So I help other people because it causes me pleasure. I avoid harming you because I get the pain from punishment, or I feel pain if you're feeling pain. And there are all sorts of other examples that we can think of. But I want to suggest this. I want to suggest that Bentham may, a couple things. One is that Bentham may have it backwards. In other words, it may be that Bentham's psychology here is wrong. He deals with pleasure and pain as though pleasure and pains were abstracted from the activities that we engage in. So I want pleasure, just pleasure. Or pain, just pain. It doesn't matter. I can use that calculus in the first six features: duration, intensity, purity, propinquity, and so on. I can use those first six ideas and to see what produces the most pleasure for me. But those are dealing with pleasures and pains as abstract notions. Remember that Bentham believes, or I should say, is trying to develop a mathematical moral theory on the analogy of physics, essentially on the idea of motion. When we measure the speed of an object, we don't care if that object is an apple, a seed, a grape, a bullet, a thrown shirt, or whatever it is. We don't say, well, the apple moved at this speed, but some other object wouldn't. No, we abstract from the object that's moving. And so we just measure the speed, the velocity. Bentham is dealing with pleasures and pains in that way. He's abstracting from the events or the activities that give rise to pleasures. So, in fact, while we may sometimes abstract pleasures from the activities that give rise to them, we mostly don't. When I get pleasure from reading a book, I mean, that pleasure that I'm getting from reading a book is about reading the book. If you said to me, Neil, I know you get pleasure from reading a book, but instead of getting pleasure from reading a book, I'm going to give you an ice cream cone. Get pleasure from that instead. I would say, no, I want the pleasure from reading a book right now, not the pleasure from eating an ice cream cone. It doesn't make sense if you said that. And so what Bentham is doing, the mistake that he's making, excuse me, this is a long video, I apologize. It will probably cause you some pain. but you'll have the pain from this video as opposed to the pain from slamming your hand in a car door. I'm assuming that makes a difference to you. I'm guessing that most of you would rather have the pain from having to watch this long video from having the pain of slamming your hand in the car door in a car door. They're not the same thing, and I thought I think that's a pretty clever comparison there, example, but you get the idea. So what Bentham is doing is the mistake he's making is abstracting pleasures and pains from the activities that give rise to them. And so the pleasure I get from eating a steak, I'm sorry to vegetarians and vegans, from eating a hamburger, whatever, that's the pleasure I want. Not the pleasure of eating broccoli, if there is such a thing. So you can see how that is, and one of the other things that happens here then is that Bentham probably has a lot of this reversed, and that is to say that that we can ask the question, if something is good, and this is what Bentham is kind of saying. He's saying that something is good because it causes pleasure. It may be true, and it probably is true, that something causes pleasure because it's good. In other words, when someone is disloyal to me, or does something that causes me pain, the pain is the disloyalty is I mean, it causes pain, but it causes pain because I value loyalty. If I didn't value loyalty, it wouldn't cause me pain. If I didn't value truth telling, it wouldn't cause me pain when you lied. If I didn't value friendship, it wouldn't cause me pain if you violated friendship. In other words, we desire. Sorry about that. I got tongue-tied and brain-tied. Let me try that again. The idea is that because I value friendship, I get pleasure from it. I don't seek pleasure and therefore friendship. I value friendship and I get pleasure from valuing it. I get pleasure from loyalty because I value loyalty. If I didn't value loyalty, it would give me no pleasure. I get pleasure from eating hamburgers because I like hamburgers. If I didn't like hamburgers, it would give me no pleasure. So for people who don't like hamburgers to say, here's a hamburger, you'll get pleasure from this. No, not unless I like hamburgers. And I won't get pleasure from a hamburger, even if I like hamburgers, if I've just eaten. I've got to value it first, and that gives me pleasure. I've got to value loyalty and friendship and knowledge for them to give me pleasure. If I didn't value those, they would not give me pleasure. So what Bentham has done is he's reversed the order of these things. It is true that we get pleasure from many, many, many things, but we get pleasure from many, many things because we value many things. But that does not mean that we seek just or we only seek pleasure. And I can sort of say that this way. We value friendships even when they are painful. We value a learning even in a sense when it is painful. And so it's not that we're seeking the pleasure. We're seeking, the knowledge, the learning, the friendship, the loyalty, and therefore that gives us pleasure. I think what I'm going to do is stop here. This may be the last episode on Bentham. I have to think about it a bit, but I'm going to stop here, and then we'll figure out in what direction we move. Thanks.